College football nerds here talking Texas and Alabama. Both had kind of easy cupcakes in the opening weekend, and now Alabama takes their first trip on the road, I think, in 10 years, Josh, to play a out-of-conference Power 5 opponent. It's been the neutral site city lately, and this is exciting for college football. I, for one, Josh, am not very anti-neutral site game. I think there's some cool environment situations there. We saw that with Florida State and LSU. But this is also cool, too, getting them on campus. It's going to be 90-something degrees Saturday, which might play into this game. We're going to talk about it in a little bit. But, Josh, to get us started, let's give Alabama fans maybe a little primer. And for both of y'all, both Alabama fans and Texas fans, we did previews for both of these teams. So if you want to check that out. Now, we got more relevant data than maybe our previews, but it might be worth checking out. Josh, give Alabama fans a little bit of primer on what they can expect. They know Steve Sarkisian, but they may not know Quinn Ewers. They may not know Bijan Robinson. What they can expect Saturday based on what you saw in the opener against ULM.
So first, howdy y'all. I'm actually on camera for once. They finally let me out. My parole officer says if I'm good, I can keep doing this at least 2 days a week. So we'll see how that works. My primer really on Texas is that they've got a handful of really good players, and then there's a lot on this roster that needs to sort of step up to get to the rest of them. The biggest name that most people know is Bijan Robinson. I would say he and Xavier Worthy are really 1A and 1B to what makes this offense tick. If you look at the Louisiana-Monroe game and what they did offensively, everything really, in my opinion, keyed off Bijan Robinson. Just looking at it here, 71 yards on just 10 carries. That was a 7.1 yard per carry average. But more than that, I felt like whenever they needed to get yards or wanted to get a drive together to put some points on the board, they just dumped it off to Bijan whatever way they felt like, let him move forward. A lot of people are familiar with Xavier Worthy. He's a guy that almost ended up playing his career at Michigan, ended up at Texas. Alabama's a school that also wanted him. And what Worthy really brings to the offense is a sort of an element of an explosiveness. And the guy I would compare him to, if you're an Alabama fan, would be probably Calvin Ridley. He's the kind of guy that's smooth. He's more physical than I think a lot of people realize. He'll definitely break a tackle. That was one of the biggest things he did last year in the Big 12. And then I'll say a third guy that really looked like he's coming on strong is Jatavian Sanders. I felt like more than anything what he does is he gives a bit of a safety net for Quinn Ewers at quarterback to sort of settle in. And then let's talk a little bit about Ewers and what he is. We were debating really whether or not he'd be the starting quarterback. I kind of felt like maybe he wouldn't, and I was surprised when they moved forward. And the reason for that is if you go back and looked at their spring game, really it's the only tape any of us have, I felt like there was a lot of reason to believe that Ewers was very inconsistent in his reads and in his really his performance, accuracy, however you want to do it. The quarterback position is really predicated upon making good decisions, but also knowing what decision you're going to make such that you set your feet and you throw on time and on rhythm. Ewers doesn't always do that. He's very likely to throw to the guy that he's supposed to throw to on a given play. Sometimes it's good, sometimes it's bad. And because of that, sometimes his feet aren't in the right position and the throw is a little bit errant. But what he does bring to the table is if he has his feet set and he's throwing, he can throw anywhere on the field. He can make any point throw. And so that gives them an ability to go over the top. My expectation from Texas, and you don't really see this against a team like Louisiana-Monroe, my expectation is that Texas is going to really focus on being an offense that's predicated on the run and then lets Ewers just try to make a handful of shot plays that everyone knows Sark is really good at scheming up. So with Ewers, you have the ability to take those deep shots and probably complete them at a high percentage if the guys are open. The position they were at, if they'd gone some other direction at quarterback, I don't think Hudson Card would have been able to do that. So he may have been better at dinking and dunking without being as turnover prone, but you probably would have lost the ability to complete those deep shots on a consistent basis. He's just too inaccurate. So even if a guy's wide open, he will overthrow a receiver in a way Ewers won't. So that's sort of my primer. Now, I'm going to turn this around a little bit and talk about the other parts of the team, right? Because we can talk about the defense, and Overshone is the one guy you want to know at linebacker. But my concern with Texas is really the depth of the roster. The factoid I'd throw out, last year, based off my research, B.J. Foster was the highest ranked DB recruit playing in the Big 12. And as Texas fans know, Foster got sidelined late in the year, right? He ends up transferring. You end up seeing him in an FCS team. He didn't even get to a P5 team. So what does that say, right? That when you look at the 5-star talent, if you look at the college team composite for Texas, yeah, they're ranked as a top 10 team. I think it's a bit of a paper tiger. The depth of that roster is not great. The sort of offensive and defensive lines are not where you'd like them to be. And I think if you look at the core of that roster, it probably doesn't live up to its billing. That's not Sarkisian's fault, but it's something that they're going to really have to deal with in this game.
And on the flip side for Alabama, like we saw, they were, that mega monster that we've seen for a while in Tuscaloosa. The concern we had for both Alabama and Georgia coming into this season was, there's question marks at wide receiver. And we've talked recently, we've been pretty heavy on this, that one of the biggest determining factors in terms of incoming talent from the next year, carryover talent, a lot of people think it's offensive line. It's really wide receiver and DB. And, there was this concern because, yes, Alabama recruits really well, but who's going to fill in the gaps at wide receiver? Burton looked great Saturday. Prentice looked incredible, and that's the thing that they didn't really have last year was that slot weapon. JoJo was hurt a good bit, and they just really didn't have that dynamic piece in the slot. Of course, Jahmyr Gibbs was incredible. I think he was 93 yards, 9-something per carry. And one thing I really liked seeing from Bryce Young that I didn't see as much of last year, at least to this level, was, and they called it out on the broadcast, was his game management. Moving everybody around, moving pieces, really reading the defense. I think that slot touchdown or that quick slant touchdown to Burton was all just what he saw at the line. But Josh, in thinking about what we saw from Alabama Saturday, I'm trying to think in my head around this 19-point spread, which has moved up. I think it opened at 14, 17-ish on Saturday, and then after the games it moved even further. I feel like Texas can manufacture some points. Either they're going to hit a shot or two that's going to lead to some points. There's some question marks in the secondary for Alabama, not in terms of talent, but just getting all the pieces settled. But looking at what I saw from Alabama Saturday, even with what I called out on our live show, Bryce Young did miss some passes in the red zone. People killed me for it, but I think he had 2 or 3 to Holden that were not great. That just maybe first game of the year sort of thing. It wasn't really a criticism. We know what he can do. But even if Bryce Young isn't 100%, the offensive line looked better. They've got depth for once at running back. Let's say that Texas can score some points. Is it going to matter in the grand scheme of things just because nobody's keeping Alabama from scoring 40 plus?
And I think that's the ultimate question, right? The question with Alabama is, how do you deal with a team that's a 19-point favorite? Someone that last week, not only did they get up 55-0 to start the second half, they got up 55-0, scoring on every drive they played, and allowing 2 first downs in 10 drives from Utah State. And Utah State was 19th in the country in total offense. Now, they're about average in yard per play. Several teams slowed them down or shut them down largely, not to that extent. It really felt like if Alabama had their starters in, and frankly, numerically, it does track that way, I think they could have scored 100 points on Utah State. And that's an 11-win team from last season, so they're not a bad football team. Not saying they're good, but they're a lot better than Louisiana Monroe. So I'm not really sure what you do. That's the conundrum, right? I agree with you. There's some pieces that are coming into play now for Alabama that have turnover. One is the corner position. They've got a lot of competition at the corner position, but I think it's in large part because they don't really quite know if they have somebody that can lock down one side of the field. I think they're comfortable with McKinstry at one corner. The other slot, they got 3 guys competing. Eli Ricks is banged up. I saw in one shot of the Utah State game, he was wincing in pain. I think he genuinely has a back issue. And then they have a junior college transfer, Kyrie Jackson, that played in the national title game. And just like the title game, you can see at times he gets out of phase. He's a very, very physical guy, very long, unusually fast and long for that position, but he's just not as consistent, I think, as they'd like. I actually think he's more talented, this may be heresy, than Eli Ricks. But his consistency and technique isn't quite to that point yet. And then finally, you've got a freshman that actually started the game in Terrian Arnold. So they've got a lot of options, but I could see Sarkisian leveraging, again, you get Xavier Worthy on a new starting corner. You have Ewers throwing deep. Maybe they put some points on the board. Is it enough? Because even if that happens, right? Even if Texas hits on 3 shots, they get 21 points in the game. It's hard to see Alabama scoring less than 30. Honestly, on almost anyone. I think the receivers aren't quite on the same page yet. But if you look at the pieces they have at running back at receiver, the fact that they have a Heisman candidate quarterback, had one of the craziest throws I've ever seen, a sidearm throw over the middle of the field, they're going to hit on a lot of plays. They're going to have scoring drives. Texas's defense has still got a long way to improve to be an elite unit, and I think even a top-end elite unit would struggle to hold this team to 30. So I'm kind of curious your thoughts on it as well. I mean, do you think Alabama is genuinely an unstoppable juggernaut on offense, or is it more like the Notre Dame-Ohio State situation? Is it possible to slow them down, hold them to 24 or 25 if you play really good defensive play? And again, you can even take a step further in this conversation and say, if that's even the case, can Texas do it?
I don't know. I think that, the thing we saw with Notre Dame, no offense to Texas fans or their team right now, I think Notre Dame's got a better defense, at least fundamentally in the front 7, than Texas. And that's why one of the reasons why they were able to slow Ohio State down. And they still give it 24 points. And Ohio State, like you said Saturday night, if they had one more quarter of football, they're probably putting 2 more touchdowns on the board. I think Alabama looked in a lot of ways like Georgia in that they look like they're in week 6 or week 7. And that's one of the hallmarks of Alabama. And I think what we're going to see with Georgia too, in that you get what you get out of the gate. They are going to improve a little bit over the course of the year, but they have some sort of magic where they come out pretty strong from the start. One of the things that you didn't really point on or pick on that I think is worth talking about, and this might be a little bit of hypothetical because we don't exactly know, but I feel like the Texas offensive line is going to struggle with, Dallas Turner and Will Anderson and complex blitz packages. I don't know if we're talking about shot plays, if Quinn's going to have time to get the ball downfield, because I feel like he might be running for his life. And that's, when we talk about how Brian Kelly probably started Jaden Daniels at quarterback because he knew he's going to have a quarterback running for his life because that offensive line was that bad. I think that we might have to see some running yards from the quarterback at Texas if they're going to keep the chains moving, which maybe takes that shot play out of the equation. So we did this last time. I'd like to do it this time too. Josh, if we are in the third quarter of this game, early fourth quarter, and it's just a struggle, just a dogfight, which would be surprising to everybody, what does that mean that's gone wrong for Alabama?
I think the thing that really would have to go wrong for Alabama to end up in a dogfight is that Alabama's offensive line is going to have issues. Last year, that was the common denominator. People talk about injuries to receiver, and yeah, they lost Jamison Williams to a targeting call in the Auburn game. They lost Mechie and then Williams in the playoff. But I think if you back up a little bit and you look at the LSU game in particular, it was pretty clear they had both receivers. It was the offensive line that gave them fits. And it was injuries to the offensive line last year that really caused them a lot of problems down the stretch. So the one thing I will say Texas does have is some athletes on the edge. And I think it's possible that you can maybe expose the fact that they've got a Vandy transfer who's played SEC football, played at Vandy, but he played against Georgia and teams like that at left tackle. They've got a second-year player at right tackle. I don't know if he's a redshirt freshman or freshman. It's all kind of strange in COVID in the way that they do redshirts this time. But you've got 2 new players in the edges with a team that struggled with it. They didn't manage to have their full starting roster in the opener. There's reason to believe there could be some inconsistency on the offensive side of the ball when you're talking offensive line. And if that happens, I do think the offense could slow down a lot, because what they really lack is guys that can get open quickly in space with experience. There's 2 guys that you really want to remember on the roster as names that maybe you don't know, and that's really Jaheim Otis and Kobe Prentice. They're 2 freshmen starting at nose guard and slot wide receiver respectively. I think it's really notable that Prentice is starting. One, it says a lot about what they think about him. If you go back, I'm not sure if it's Amari Cooper or Calvin Ridley, That was the last time they had an actual true freshman named as the full starter. It may have even gone further back than that. I'm not sure they've had somebody on that depth chart without a slash as a starting wide receiver as a true freshman. But it says a lot about what he is, but I also think it says a lot about the depth they have at that kind of skill. JoJo Earl was supposed to be the guy to step into that role. He hurt his lower body. Slade Bolden graduated, and I think they just don't have another real option as somebody that can get open in short yardage space. And so it's not just about long speed, which I think Prentice has, might blow the top off the defense at some point. I think it's more about having somebody that can actually get open in a slot, some sort of quick throw, some sort of outlet, and that takes short yardage agility. And so that was something I think they really missed last year when the offensive line was banged up, because Earl got hurt at the same time. And I think Bolden did a good job, but he still wasn't a great outlet. So in my view, for them to be in a dogfight, one, it's going to have to be low scoring. I don't think... Look, Turner is a first-round draft pick and would be the best pass rusher on probably 126 out of 130 teams. And Anderson is a tier and a half better than him. This is just those two guys on their own really blow up anything an offense wants to do. And they were phenomenal, I think, in that opener. But, I think maybe it starts with the ability to slow down the offense. And I'm curious, is there something you think defensively that Alabama could potentially be exploited? We talked about corner, but I'm going to hedge it a little bit towards linebacker because that's something we were talking about earlier.
Yeah, the one thing that's given Alabama fits in the past, especially Texas A&M, is running backs and tight ends in the passing game. And it's I don't know if it's because their linebacker, how their linebackers are built or their scheme or whatever, but they have the tendency to either completely leave a running back uncovered or just lose guys in space. And I think that's an opportunity here, probably not to score, but to keep the chains moving to a point that keeps this playing keep away with the Alabama offense. There's a lot that's being said about Sarkisian knowing this defense and knowing this scheme and knowing how to dial up some points against it. But Saban made a good point yesterday. He said, everybody assumes, these teams know us, but they also forget that we know them too. And I think that, for me, if this thing goes really sideways for Texas, and there is an opportunity here, and Texas fans, I hope Texas fans don't feel that we're like hating on their team or whatever. This is just a bad matchup, in my opinion, for them. So if they feel the tenor of this conversation being a little bit negative, I think there's some good things that they can show Saturday. I don't think they're going to win the game. One of the reasons why I think this might have a chance to turn sideways for Texas, even if they can hit some plays to their back, I think they will, to their backs and tight ends, is Alabama usually plays pretty vanilla against these cupcake teams. They usually look ugly, and Saban's got something to complain about. I think years ago it was like Colorado State or somebody. It was real ugly. They didn't win by a lot of points. But that's what he does. In these games, he works on the things that they're not good at. If that's what they were doing against Utah State, because there were some things that were a little herky-jerky, and new offensive line, new wide receiver, there's a lot of skill position players or a lot of players in the offense that are new faces. But it could be that some of that was just they're working on things that they're not great at yet, which means they have a whole bag of tricks that they didn't even break out Saturday. I think the flip side of that is with a rookie quarterback, and you've got a lot of moving pieces, especially with Nayor getting hurt and having to rely on maybe some second-string guys at wide receiver. I think that they were probably showing you what they're going to show you Saturday. Certainly they've got some things schematically and some things in terms of, shot plays that are still in the bag. But I think to get this quarterback comfortable with what he's going to do against Alabama, they had to try to run him through all of the paces against a lesser opponent. And he still didn't look elite. They put up a bunch of points because they really could out-athlete ULM. But he didn't look like somebody that was super comfortable yet. He might be by week 6 or 7. And I almost wish this game was in 6 or 7 weeks. But that to me is the concern, is Alabama probably was playing at 70% Saturday. Texas was playing at 100%. And what we saw was things that if you know Alabama, you're going to see some problems. So, Josh, before we get into predictions, give me one more thought on matchups and maybe something we haven't talked about in terms of, you touched on the Alabama defense. How much of an unexpected pleasant surprise from the Texas offensive line are we going to have to see for A&M to exploit what might be a weakness in the secondary? Is it something that like, hey, we haven't seen that in years, or hey, if they're just a little bit better than last year, they can probably get into it?
Well, first I'm gonna have to call you out because you just said A&M. So I think
sorry.
every Texas fan right now is screaming. Some of them have just thrown their laptops out the window. Um, cats are laying with dogs. It's a terrible, terrible world we're in. No, I think the reality for Texas is you're going to have to see the offensive line have the performance of their lives. Texas did give LSU a great game a few years ago. That was 2019, right? There were a lot of factors that came into play in that, but the biggest one is that they were able to hold point offensively throughout the entire game. It wasn't just Sam Ehlinger being who he was, which is a guy that could be an absolute gamer. They also hit some big plays down the field. And I think they took advantage of the fact that LSU early in that year really wasn't a great defense because they weren't very consistent. So I think the offensive line's going to have to play. I mean, they have to play phenomenal, but I do still feel like early in that game, Louisiana Monroe got more push in the interior than I expected. I think there is the possibility that Texas could pound the ball a little bit between the tackles and kind of wear on Alabama. That was something a number of teams did last year. They had some success right up the middle and just kind of leaning on them. And it took about halfway through the season before Alabama did eventually totally shut that down. But it reared its ugly head again at the end of the Georgia game. So, yeah, I'm kind of curious. Maybe we can have a conversation on this part of it. It's hard for me to understand really where the edge would be from Texas. I can talk about hitting a couple shot plays. I can talk about running Bijan Robinson underneath and trying to wear down the center of that defensive line. But I have to think, right? Alabama has the edge on the edge, and Alabama has enough running backs and a good enough interior offensive line that they're going to be able to pound Texas. So, I mean, don't you agree with me? It really feels like Texas is never going to have an outright advantage in this game. They've got to find little things they do well and then kind of hope everything else doesn't snowball against them.
I think it's a couple of things. I think one, it's that crowd. I think it's a home game, super hot, crazy crowd. We saw Alabama beat Florida by 2 points last year. They hung on. They were way better than that Florida team. But they were clinging to dear life by the end of that game. And I think that there's possibility that there's some of that. Like if Alabama was a little bit off on Saturday at home against Utah State, I could see that happening. So I think it's a combination of that crowd noise, maybe forcing some offensive mistakes or drives that should end in points that don't, maybe some quick 3-and-outs, and then playing keep away from Alabama by yes, maybe getting some scores here or there with shot plays, but mostly tight ends and running backs. Wide receiver screens generally don't do well against Alabama when they have a physical secondary, and right now they're pretty physical. You talk about that Kyrie Jackson versus Eli Ricks. He blew up a blocking slot wide receiver into a wide receiver catching a screen Saturday and tackled him with the offensive player. So I don't think wide receiver screens are going to work, but that little space right there between your outside players and your offensive line, they can find some yards. And if they can find enough yards to keep the ball moving, it's all about slowing, really, really going slow, shortening the game, finding points where you can, and just kind of getting into the fourth quarter. I don't think it's going to happen, and that's why I'll give you my score right now. I don't think it's going to happen because I think Alabama can also stretch the field in ways that Texas isn't ready for, but I think it's a little closer than maybe people are feeling. I've got 34-17, and I do think that crowd's going to come into play. I think that heat's going to come into play. And look, Alabama plays in the heat too, but when LSU plays in the heat, and that team was dead tired by the end of that game in 2019, and that's when people start scoring, even people that are not quite as on your level, because that's a great equalizer. So 34-17, Alabama, a little bit more of a dogfight than they're expecting. Give me your score.
My score prediction for this one's probably going to be a lot more lopsided. It's 19 points for a reason. I don't think it's an unrealistic spread. But when you talk 20 points, 30-10, 40-20 is kind of where the range it's at. I think this game's going to be, I'm going to say 42-13. And I don't think Alabama's going to run up the score on their old coach, but I think they're probably going to be in a position to do so. I don't think that's a bold take necessarily. And, this is something we talked about a lot. There's a comparison between Alabama and Georgia. I left Alabama number 1 in my top 10 rankings this week. We redo it every week. We shuffle everything. And the reality for me is Alabama was darn near spotless. And I don't see any particular flaws on this team, just like I don't see any particular flaws on Georgia. And I think Texas is still in a rebuilding mode. And the problem in football is that very often you're defined not by your best player, but by your worst on the field. And when you face an elite team, and this is where, like we've talked to receivers, right? Alabama has a little bit of a rebuilt receiving core. They get Burton, who is the top receiver from Georgia. They have Trayshawn Holden, who's come on big for them. They have another guy, Harrell, that from Louisville, we both think might actually be the best receiver on the team, but he was in a walking boot and probably will be out, I would guess, for about a month before he's healthy enough to really contribute. Sure, those guys are great with a Heisman Trophy winner. But the big thing I think people aren't really talking about enough is the fact that last year, at one point, they had no healthy scholarship running backs. Brian Robinson was the only guy for the latter part of the year, and he was dealing with leg injuries. But they lost Roydale Williams to injury 2/3 of the way of the year, and he was playing because they lost Chase McClellan to injury early in the year. That's not a problem for them anymore. They can, if they want to, pound the ball play after play. And like the Cincinnati game didn't get out of hand because, yeah, they ran it like crazy with Robinson, but he had to come out at some point. And when he came out, they lost that physicality. They lost the ability to pound the ball down up the middle, and they kind of became one-dimensional every time he rotated. The fact that they can rotate properly, I think, really makes this Alabama team a lot more dangerous compared to what I think is a much improved offensive line. I don't think Texas is going to be able to hold serve. I think they're going to get in a hole. And I think their plan is probably going to be very conservative offensively. If I'm Sarkisian, I don't want a freshman quarterback trying to take too many aggressive shots. So because of that, I think that they're going to try to back off a little bit, try to take shot plays when they can. Maybe they connect on a couple of them, which is where, maybe 13 points comes from. But I don't think they're going to move the ball with any consistency. So, yeah, I'm going to say 42-13. I think this is a really tough matchup for Texas. I think they have a long way to go. And we talked about that in our preview. I think this roster is more of a rebuilding job, frankly, than Saban inherited. They don't have the defensive and offensive line core that Saban got in 2007. And it's going to take Sark a few years to really get this roster to where it needs to be. And this is trying to climb the top of the mountain. This is playing 2005 USC right out the gate this year, and I think it's just too far.
All right, y'all, that's it for Alabama and Texas. Let us know in the comments what you think this game's going to look like. Give us your score prediction. We'll mix it up with you. And also, we did a video on CFP expansion. We're not wild about it. If you've followed us for a while, you might know that as well. And for you Alabama fans that hung on this late, this is a little bit of Sabro Singularity from Trip Tab. I had it on the live show Saturday too. Pretty awesome brewery down in Birmingham, Alabama. So give us your score prediction, but also check out that video. And then if you want to get our whole live show that we did Saturday night, we've got it on podcast version, links in the description. Also, you can find it on our channel. Thanks so much, y'all. Have a great week, and God bless.